Everyone, and welcome to the second day of the conference and the second plenary talk. I'm very honored and very happy to have with us Professor Kaivan Munshi. He doesn't need much of an introduction, but just as a formality, I would anyway want to say a few words. Most of us know Professor Kaivan Munshi as the Frank Ramsey Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge. And he, in 2017, received the Infosys Prize for the Social Sciences for his seminal work on informal community networks in developing countries. He's done some very careful empirical work to establish causal relationships between community networks and individual decision making in developing countries and its impact on labor markets. And one another strand of literature which he's worked on and has contributed to significantly is related to gender, marriage markets, and the intersection with kinship networks. And so today's presentation is related to the second strand of work of his. And so without much ado, a very warm welcome to you, Professor Munshi. And we'll have the talk for about 50 minutes or so, and then 10 minutes of question and answers.
Very much for inviting me. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is joint work with a number of people, as you could have backgrounds, which in a way reflects the nature. Can you hear me at the back? It's not working. It's working. It's okay. Economic progress, and we would expect that with this progress, there would be greater gender equality. But at least on this one dimension, the problem has, if anything, gotten worse over time. So let me just give you some statistics which give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. So this is data from two census rounds, the 1991 census and the 2011 census. And what we're reporting here is the number of boys per 100 girls for children aged 0 to 6. So just to give you a sense of what is the natural benchmark, well, there's always a sort of, naturally a slight excess of boys over girls at birth. And that ranges from about 103 to 106. Typically, people will pin this down at about 105. There isn't a similar sort of well-established benchmark for the child sex ratio. And for that, in this paper, what we do is we just say, well, okay, let's look, for example, at South India. And I'm going to show you in a few slides why this is a useful benchmark to use, because it's generally believed that until relatively recently, you did not have sex selection in South India. So if you go back to the 1961 census or the 1971 census, and you look at the sex ratio for the 0 to 6-year-old children, it's about 102.5. So let's use that as the benchmark. So if we take that as the natural benchmark for the child sex ratio, you can see here that the sex ratio for the worst states in the country is severely elevated and is getting worse over time. The all India averages are less dramatic, but you can see that this is also elevated and is getting worse over time. And even South India, which, as I said, we didn't have sex selection until relatively recently, has been catching up and is pretty close now to the all India average. So this is just give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. And of course, there's been lots of work done to try to understand this. Much of this work has looked at changes in sex ratios over time, or has focused on particular subpopulations, particular states, or particular castes where this problem is especially severe. The first contribution of our research is to document substantial variation in sex ratios on a new, which is within castes or jatis, which are in some sense the fundamental building block of Indian society. And what we're going to see here is that in a district in South India, which is really completely unexceptional with respect to both socioeconomic characteristics as well as sex ratios, you're going to see as much variation within castes or jatis as there is across all states in the country. So that is going to be the first contribution of this paper. And this is just simply looking in the data. There's nothing fancy over here. We just have new data which allows us to do this for the first time. And then the second contribution is to try to understand why you see this variation within these castes. And for that, we're going to focus on the structure of the marriage institution and show that there are particular features of the marriage institution in India which generate imperfections in the marriage markets which operate independently within these castes. And that is going to be our second contribution. Now, we're not the first people to make the connection between marriage and sex selection. In fact, it's widely believed that the main cause of sex selection in India is the high dowries that girls' parents must pay at the time of marriage. It is also believed that the wealthy are the ones who are more likely to practice sex selection because they pay higher dowries. But this last argument obviously has some sort of potential logical inconsistency, because you could imagine that these wealthy parents of girls who are paying higher dowries are also getting them to marry into wealthier families where they end up consuming at a higher level. So if the girl's parents internalize this, then it's not obvious that having a girl is necessarily worse for the wealthy than it is for the less wealthy. So what we do in this paper is to develop a model which sort of clarifies the connection between wealth, marriage, and sex selection. And as I said, what we're going to do is to focus on particular imperfections market, which are going to give rise to this particular problem. Okay? And just to be clear, what we're not trying to claim that other explanations for sex selection are not relevant or important. Preference for sons, there are other things going on as well. What we're trying to do in this paper is identify or sort of show there's this particular channel as well, which is relevant, and we will quantify the importance of this channel. Okay, so before I get to the model which makes this between wealth, marriage, and sex selection, let me give you some background on the changes over time in sex selection in South India. And I think this research, our study area is situated in rural Tamil Nadu. And the second reason is because, in a way, this description of the changes over time in South India will be a nice sort of starting point for the model that follows. Now, the basic marriage rule in India is that you have to marry within your caste or your jati. There are 4,000 castes in India, and there's recent genetic evidence which indicates that people have been marrying in this way for somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years. There's now plenty of survey evidence, some stuff that I have done. There's also work from representative surveys which indicate that over 95% of Indians continue to marry within their caste. So that's something which is very common throughout the country. But the additional feature of marriage in South India was close-kin marriage. So the most preferred match for a girl was her mother's younger brother, or if he was not available, one of the mother's brother's sons. Now, marriage in India is patrilocal. So what this meant was, at the time of marriage, the girl was basically moving either into her maternal grandfather's home or a maternal uncle's home. Now, these two families were clearly very, very closely connected to each other. And it was almost as if it was one corporative unit. And when these girls were marrying, this was happening over many, many generations. Effectively, there were these two dynasties that were trading girls from one generation to the next. So in one generation, the girl went from one side to the other, and the next generation, the daughter went in the opposite direction. So there was this very close cooperation. There was no payment at the time of marriage. There was a ritual payment known as a Sridan, which was just a small payment to the girl, but there was no dowry as we know it at that time. And there was essentially no disadvantage to having a girl either, because you were sort of trading in some sense back and forth. And thus there was no sex selection. Now, a number of very distinguished social scientists like Srinivas and Caldwell have linked the emergence of sex selection and dowries in South India in the early 1980s to economic development. And so the basic idea that they have put forward is that with economic development, all of a sudden you had inequality within these castes. And so two dynasties that had been linked for many generations, which had very similar levels of wealth, suddenly didn't have it anymore. Karin Kapadia is a social anthropologist who's written a very nice ethnography on a Tamil village called Shiva and Her Sisters, where she describes what happened at this particular time in the 1980s and the 1990s as the marriage arrangements were changing in South India. And she describes, for example, stories where there was a mother who had married in the traditional fashion, and her husband had done very well. And now came the time for the daughter to marry, and the mother was thinking to herself, well, there was her own younger brother, but he was clearly at a different place economically, whereas relative to where they were. And the story was, of course, that the younger brother, he understood that this was not going to work anymore, and then the girl ended up marrying someone else. And so the way this happened was that marriages continued to be within the caste, but now a marriage market appeared. And so essentially what you had was, in some sense, it was like a one-shot thing from a generational perspective. And so these marriages, these parents were now matching their daughters to other families, and there was a market which emerged, and there was a dowry which emerged as well to clear the market. So today, in fact, dowries in South India are as high as they are in North India. But it's actually interesting to note that this is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's only started off in the early 1980s or so. And with the dowries and with the emergence of the marriage market also came sex selection. So, of course, people have noticed the temporal correlation between the dowries and the sex selection. And it's tempting to conclude from that that it was the dowries which were the sort of driving force of the sex selection. But what we're going to argue in this paper is that underneath that, at a more fundamental level, there were particular imperfections in the marriage market which gave rise to the sex selection. Okay, so where does this research fit relative to the literature? And I think we're really at the intersection of the macro family economics literature and the micro development literature. So the macro family economics literature is really concerned with trying to understand how technological progress changes very important family decisions like marriage, fertility, investments in children, female labor force participation, etc. Now within that literature, there is a smaller literature on marriage. And what this literature tries to do is to understand how, for example, individual decisions affect the sorting equilibrium, which in turn feeds back into those decisions. And our paper is very much in this kind of spirit, as you will see. We're also connected to a sort of micro-development literature, and I think the work of Sivan Anderson is perhaps most relevant over here, where she looks at how economic development affects the marriage institution and in particular dowries. So she has early work on how economic development gives rise to dowry inflation. She has more recent work which tries to break up the different components of marriage payments. And she shows how with economic development, these kinds of changes can actually disempower women. In our analysis, we're not looking at the dynamics. The institutional transformation has already occurred. Closed-in marriage is starting to break down, and this new marriage market has already come into place. But what we want to do, like in the marriage literature, is to make the connection between, we want to look at the interaction, the two-way interaction between the marriage market equilibrium and one particular decision of the family, which is what gender to select for the child. And that is where our analysis links up to this particular literature. Okay? So there are essentially 5 features of the marriage institution that we're going to be using in our analysis, some of it in the theory, some of it in the empirical work. The first is that marriages are endogamous within the caste or the jati. I've already talked about that. The second is that marriages are arranged with family wealth being a major consideration. The third is that marriages involve a dowry payment. This is true now even in South India. The fourth is that marriages are patrilocal. The fifth is that the social norm is that all girls must marry. Now, the last thing has actually been noted by demographers, but I don't think people have made the connection between this and sex selection. But this is going to be very critical to our story. In fact, the last 2 aspects of the marriage institution are going to be the proximate determinants of sex selection in our model, as you will see. Now, before I get to the model, let me just give you a little background, show you some descriptive statistics from our study area, which line up with these particular, this list of, institutional features that I just described. Now, the South India Community Health Study, as we call it, is essentially a multi sort of, it's a project with many different components to it, many different parts to it. And it covers a rural population of 1.1 million individuals residing in Vellore district in Tamil Nadu. So for those of you who are not familiar with the geography of Tamil Nadu, Vellore is basically at the very north of the state. It's up against Andhra Pradesh. It's on the border with Andhra Pradesh. The study area, as you're going to is basically very representative of rural Tamil Nadu as well as rural South India. So if you look at, for example, the age distribution, if you look at marriage patterns, if you look at literacy, if you look at labor force participation, both for men as well as for women, it's going to be very, very similar between our study area, rural Tamil Nadu, as well as rural South India, which we defined by the states of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and Maharashtra. Okay, so there's nothing special about this place in terms of its characteristics. In this paper, we're going to use 2 components of the 6. The first and the main one is going to be a census of all 300,000 households that we conducted in the study area. And what this gives us, of course, crucially, is the caste of everyone, of every household, And in addition, we know the gender of all kids aged 0 to 6. And as you will see later on, in terms of the size of our data, we have a very large number of individuals within each caste. And what this allows us to do is to look within the caste, to look at how sex ratios vary within the caste. And this is going to be, as I said, one of the key features of our analysis. In addition to that, we're going to take advantage of a detailed 5,000 representative households that we conducted as well. And in the survey, we collected information on the marriages of the households' heads' children over the last 5 years. And as well as, of course, the information about the household head's own marriage. And we'll be using that for some supplementary analysis. But the key thing here, I think, for this paper at least, is the census, which is, I think, for the first time going to allow you to look within these castes. Okay, so here is just some descriptive evidence that, patterns of marriage here look very much as what you would expect. This is information, when I say parents here, what I mean is it's the household head. And it's his, this is information about his marriage. And then for the children, these are the marriages of the children in the last 5 years. So basically, somewhere between 95 and 97% of the marriages are within the caste. 50% were of the household heads married close relatives. And this has dropped now to 35%, in line with the patterns over time that people have noticed. And 80 to 90% of these marriages are arranged. If you look at the dowry, it's somewhere between 3 to 4 times the household's annual income, which again is very much in line with other studies that have been done on dowries in the past. Notice here that the dowry that is given by females is reported to be higher than the dowry that is see this even if you put in household fixed effects, by the way. Some of this could be reporting error. You always want to say that you gave a lot, and you don't want to say you received very much, right? But as you will see, this is also consistent with our model, and you will see that in a moment. And maybe these gaps are too large, I'm not sure, but certainly this is consistent with the model as well. Okay, so now let me just jump ahead and just try to sketch out the basic structure of our model. I'm not going to get into the details, but I want you to see what it is about the marriage institution in India that could give rise to sex selection. And I just want to be clear at the outset that what we're trying to do here is to try to isolate those particular features which we think are important. We're going to abstract away from many important aspects of both the family as well as of marriage, okay, when we do this. And I think the reason for that, as you will see, is that because once you get into these kinds of models, where there is a sort of feedback between household decisions and then the sorting equilibrium, and then back in the other direction, the circularity, the models become very difficult to solve anyway. So these simplifying assumptions will at least allow us to get some analytical results, as you will see. Okay, so each family consists of just one parent and one child. So here you can see right away how we're trying to simplify things here. There's no fertility in this model, for example. The gender of the parent is irrelevant, and the child could be either male or female. Let the boy's family's wealth be X and the girl's family's wealth be Y. Now, if there was no sex selection, then the distribution of wealth on both sides of the market would be the same. But once you have sex selection, of course, the distribution of the wealth becomes different, and that's going to turn out to create all sorts of complications. Because the distribution of wealth itself is going to be endogenously determined by the sex selection. And then, of course, the distribution of wealth will then determine the pattern of matching, which in turn determines the sex selection. Okay, so there's going to be this circularity, which we're going to have to solve for. Okay, so let the wealth contingent consumption of the parents be capital C of X, capital C of Y. And for the kids, it's going to be small c of X and small c of Y. All individuals have logarithmic preferences over consumption, which actually is not that far off from, micro level evidence on what preferences look like in the data. And in addition, parents have altruistic preferences over the consumption of their children. Okay, so they put as much weight on their own consumption as they do on their kids' consumption. And there is no preference for girls over here. So the son preference is going to come out from the model, from the marriage institution. Okay, of course, in reality, there could, in addition, be a particular preference for sons. And we're going to talk about that later on in the empirical analysis. But for now, for the model, we're going to shut that down completely. Okay, and let the maximized utility on the boy's side be U of X, and on the girl's side be V of Y. Okay, so now this is the key to the model is trying to figure out what happens here in terms of the different transfers that are floating around in this particular structure. Now we're being very, as I said, we're really stripping down this model completely. So there's no production over here. The boy's side has wealth X, the girl's side has wealth Y, and that's the total amount that is taken and has to be distributed in some way between the four agents in the model, the two parents and the two children. There are no grandchildren over here. There's no education, there are no individual characteristics, okay? It's just simply an issue about trying to figure out how the total wealth or the total surplus is going to be distributed within these four people. Now, marriage is patrilocal. What this means is that at the time of marriage, the girl moves into her husband's home. And one issue here is that her parent, who is altruistic, would like to give her a bequest. And the idea here is, which is I think quite realistic, is that he can't give her the bequest when he dies, because we understand that there are all sorts of restrictions to that, at least till recently in India. And so the way that he would give her a bequest would be through the dowry. You could think of the dowry as being in some sense a pre-mortem bequest. But the problem here is that he cannot give her the money directly. So what he does is there's a dowry. He gives the money to her husband's parent, okay, and that's the amount of dowry D. Now what the husband's parent does is now he's got some wealth of his own, he's got the dowry as well, and he has to decide what to do with that. He would like to give a bequest to his son, and that is through this transfer T. But the additional thing over here is that when he gives this transfer to his son, the girl who's living with the son cannot be stopped from consuming some of that herself. So we're going to assume here that the son gets some fraction alpha, which is greater than half of the transfer, and the daughter-in-law gets the rest of it. Okay, so what you see here is that there's this very convoluted way in which these transfers are moving. The boy's parent would like to give half of his wealth to his son, but he can't do that. When he gives the transfer, some of that is siphoned off by the girl. The girl's parent would like to give half of his wealth to his daughter, but he can't do that directly. He has to give this as a dowry to the boy's parent. And then some of that trickles down to the girl. But along the way, there's all this seepage. There's like a leaky bucket. And what we're going to see is that it's this seepage which is going to give rise to the imperfection in the marriage market, which ultimately gives rise to the sex selection. Okay. So this is just giving you a list of all the different consumption levels of different agents. It's very simple, as you can see over here. The boy, which is small c of x, he gets alpha of t. The father gets x minus t plus d. The girl gets 1 minus alpha of t. And the girl's parent gets y minus d. So what's endogenous in the model is the t and the d. These are the two things that we have to solve for. Okay? All right. So what is the structure of the model? So we solve the model there's two sort of stages in the model. So initially, in the first stage, the dowry is determined. So it's determined competitively in the marriage market. Once the dowry is determined, then each boy's parent decides how much transfer to give to his son. Okay, and the way that we're going to solve this model is in 3 steps. What we're going to do is to start off by describing how the matching takes place, which is the first step. Okay, taking this timing as given, there's going to be a matching of households on the two sides of the market. And what we're going to show is that there's going to be positive assortative matching in equilibrium. That's the first step. Once we've done that, then what we're going to show is that at every wealth level, there's going to be some amount of sex selection, given the structure that we have over here, and positive dowries. And then finally, what we're going to do is to look at how the sex selection varies across the wealth distribution. And that is going to give us the prediction which we can then take to the data, and where we can look for variation in sex ratios within these castes. Okay, so just to be clear, this should be clear to you. Okay, so this is the first step. What we establish is that there's going to be positive assortative matching on wealth. Now, the first thing you should notice is that this is not obvious. When you usually think about these kinds of matching models, the reason why you get positive assortative matching is because there are some complementarities. Like you have ability or something like that, or education. Two educated parents are going to jointly produce more educated kids, or if you have higher levels of ability, they can match together for some reason because, again, there's some kind of gain from doing this. Here, there is nothing. There's no production. You just have a certain amount of wealth on the two sides, and it's going to be divided up between the parents and the children. So why do you have positive assortative matching? It has to do with the fact that all girls' parents, because they're altruistic, would like them to match with wealthier boys. Right? So that's the source of the matching. But what happens now, of course, is that it can't be that every girl's parent ends up matching with the wealthiest boy. The market has to clear as well. So what ends up happening is that you have a dowry which basically clears this market, and the dowry must be increasing steeply enough in wealth so that the matching is stable.
Sorry, so in the model, D is a number or a function? D?
It's not a number. It's going to be solved in equilibrium.
But it's a function of X and Y?
Yes. Yeah. But remember, there's not a... Yes, sorry.
You say the dowry must be increasing in wealth. Whose wealth? the boy's family's wealth?
The boy's family's wealth, yes. U is a function of X, the boy's family's wealth, yeah. So wealthier boys receive higher dowries, precisely. Okay, so that's what's going to basically clear the market. So that basically what ends up happening is that the girls' parents who are less wealthy will not be willing to pay the extra dowry that they need to pay to match up with the boys who are above them. And so at the end, what's going to happen in equilibrium is the market is going to clear from the top. The wealthiest girls will match with the wealthiest boys, and then it will move down the distribution. So that's the first result. The second result, as I said, is that in equilibrium, at every wealth level, there's going to be some amount of sex selection, and there's going to be a positive dowry. Okay? And so why is this the case? Now, what we don't want to do here, the trick here is not to try to solve for the dowry explicitly, because that's not going to be, as it turns out, we can't do this analytically with the model. It's just going to be too difficult because the dowry is also going to be a price, which has to be solved for explicitly, etc. Right? So the trick here is to just say, look, what you have, you imagine that there's two families. The girl's family has wealth Y, the boy's family has wealth X, and they come together. So the total amount of wealth that the two sides have is X plus Y, and that has to be divided up somehow. And how this is going to be divided up is going to depend on the outside options. So the outside option for the boy's side is to stay single. If the boy stays single, then his father, who has the total wealth X, will divide up equally between the two of them. So each of them is going to consume X divided by 2, and so the total utility is going to be 2 times log of X over 2. What about the girl's side? Now, given the social norm that all girls must marry, there is no outside option. And that is basically going to give them this unequal power in the marriage market, which is going to shift resources towards the boy's side. And to see how that works, let's go back now to the situation where the two sides, the boy's side has X, the girl's side has Y. So the total amount of wealth is X plus Y. Now, if the boy enters into the marriage, his side, he and his father together, regardless of how the transfers move and everything, the two of them together must get at least 2 times log of X over 2. That's what they have to get. Now, the minimum amount of wealth that they need to achieve that level of utility is exactly X, in which case they will divide it up equally between the two of them, and that will be fine. But if it turns out that they're not consuming at the same level, if for any reason the boy and his father do not consume at the same level, then the total amount of resources that they need will be even more than X, right? Because of diminishing marginal utility. Now we know that they will not consume at the same level because alpha is less than 1. So when the boy's parent decides how much of a transfer to give, he will give, as you will see, you can work it out, it's very easy to see, he will give the same amount of transfer as he consumes himself. But then he knows that some of that transfer is going to be siphoned off by the girl. And so in equilibrium, the boy will end up consuming less than his father, even though the father is completely altruistic. But because they're consuming at different levels, it means that they need more than X to satisfy the outside option. But if they take more than X, then the girl's side is going to receive less than Y. And so by the same argument, if the girl's parent had switched the sex of the child, he would have received more than Y. And he would be better off. And so this is a very simple argument to explain why you are better off with a boy than with a girl in this setup. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that every girl's parent is going to do sex selection. There's going to be a cost of sex selection, let's call it K. But as long as there are some families at every wealth level for whom the cost of sex selection is sufficiently small, then you will have sex selection at every wealth level. You will also have positive dowries because, remember, the boy side is getting more than X, needs more than X. So the only way that can happen is if there is some resources that are moving from the girl's side to the boy's side. So you will have positive dowries at every single wealth level. Okay? Now the last step is to look how sex selection varies across the wealth distribution. So let me give you a very simple example to clarify the basic idea here. So imagine now what we've shown up to this point is that the market clears from the top, right? And you moves down. And we've also shown that there is some amount of sex selection, but we're fixing it so that there are 2 boys and 1 girl at every wealth level. So what happens now? So basically, at the very top of the wealth distribution, one of the wealthiest boys matches with the wealthiest girl. The second boy matches 1 level down. When you go down to the next to highest wealth level, 1 boy matches 1 level down, and the other boy matches 2 levels down. When you go down to the third level, 1 boy matches 2 levels down, the other boy matches 3 levels down. So what you're seeing here is that as you move down, the wealth gap is increasing. And so parents of less wealthy girls are less disadvantaged from having a girl intuitively because they're matching up more. You have this hypergamy. And the hypergamy is increasing as you move down the wealth distribution. But of course, what that means, of course, is that as you move down, the cost of sex, you don't need to do as much sex selection. It's not as beneficial to actually do the sex selection. So in fact, this cannot be an equilibrium. What must be happening is that as you move down, there will be an adjustment on the sex ratio, so that in fact the sex ratios will become more favorable as you move down. They won't push it over completely. You will still have an increasing wealth gap. You will still have more hypergamy as you move down. But the sex ratio will also adjust so that in fact they are less and less biased as you move down the wealth distribution. Now this of course is a very simple example. In reality, we have to solve the model. What you have to do is to take account of the fact that the wealth distribution is determined endogenously by the sex selection. That in turn then determines the matching pattern, which in turn determines the sex selection, right? So it's sort of this circularity. In addition, you have this dowry, which is a comparative price which must be solved, and there's a fixed point to that as well. So it's very difficult to solve this model analytically. But what we can do is at 2 points in the wealth distribution, we can actually get analytical results. At the very top of the wealth distribution, where the wealthiest boys and the wealthiest girls match, we can show that sex selection is increasing with wealth. And for the last boys who match, the least wealthy boys who match, for them, their dowry is such that they're just indifferent between being married and not being married. For those guys as well, we can show that sex selection is increasing with wealth. But for the rest of the distribution, we've got to solve the model numerically. And so this is again, you just use the same structure that we have, but now instead of having a continuum of wealth classes, you're going to have a finite number of wealth classes. Some of the conditions will change, but otherwise everything else is unchanged, okay? So the first thing is to look at the matching. So the blue line is basically the 45-degree line, which is basically what you would get if boys and girls of equal wealth were matching with each other. And at the very top of the distribution, that is what you see. But as you move down, notice that the red line is to the right of the blue line. What this means is that girls are matching with wealthier boys. And this is exactly what we saw in that simple example. As you move down, the wealth gap starts to increase. And it's at its largest over here. And basically, these are the boys who are left unmatched. Okay, so this is the first result, that you have hypergamy, and this hypergamy is increasing as you move down the wealth distribution. What about the sex ratios? On the blue axis is the probability that a child is a girl. And what you see here, we showed this earlier analytically at 2 points in the distribution, but now you can see this numerically across the full distribution. The probability that the child is a girl is decreasing monotonically as you move up the wealth distribution. The dowries, in contrast, are increasing as you move up. Okay? And notice here that the dowry given at any wealth level is greater than the dowry that is received. And this is simply because of the hypergamy. So this is consistent with what I showed you earlier in the data. And this is what, as I said, comes out of the model as well. Okay? And one last thing before I get to the empirical work. So suppose you change that alpha parameter. Remember, alpha is a fraction of the transfer that is picked up by the boy. And the girl gets 1 minus alpha. So as alpha increases, the seepage in the dowry increases. And as that seepage increases, the girl's parent, of course, is basically going to be worse off in some sense, because the parent is altruistic and the parent understands that the girl is getting less and lower consumption. And so as alpha increases, what you're going to find is 2 things are going to happen in our model. The first is that you're going to see more sex selection. So this is another reason why you have sex selection here, another source of the sex selection. And so probably having a girl goes down, and the dowry goes down as well. Okay? And that's the last thing that I want to show you before we get to the empirical work. Now, one more thing I want to talk about is alternative models of sex selection. So as I said, I do not want to claim that this is the only reason why you have sex selection. This is one mechanism through which you can have sex selection. And certainly an exogenous preference for sons is another reason why you do that. You certainly have that in China, and you certainly have this in India as well. But what I would like to show is that there are predictions of our model which allows you to distinguish our mechanism from these other mechanisms. So for example, there's been previous work by Edlund and Bhaskar which essentially assumes that there's an exogenous preference for sons. Now those models will also generate the result that as you move down the wealth distribution, the sex ratios are going to get more favorable. It's the same result that we have. But there's a very big difference between their model and our model, which has to do with the dowry. So in their model, what happens is, because you have a shortage of girls, the marriage market is going to clear ex post. And so what you're going to end up with is a bride price in equilibrium. And that's exactly what you see, for example, in China. So in China, you have sex selection, but there's no one ever talks about any kind of imperfection in the marriage market. And in fact, what you have in China today is, in fact, very high bride price. What's striking about India is that you have dowries at the same time as you have sex selection. So girls there's a shortage of girls, and the money is still going from the girls' side to the boys' side, which seems to suggest that in fact the causality is going in the other direction. That there's a problem in the marriage market which is giving rise to the sex selection.
Can I ask you a quick clarification?
Yes.
In India, there'll be a shortage of girls
Yes.
for the same reason, right?
Yes.
But the girls have bad outside options because they have to
Right.
marry. How is it in your model that the latter always dominates the former? In other words, how do you? Can
we hold off to that at the end?
Sure.
Let's. I can tell you about it, but just hold off, okay? So there is actually some evidence. I see Sonia in the audience. So there is actually some evidence here that there is a direct connection between marriage and sex selection. Now, this is not in our model. The dowries and the sex selection are jointly determined. But what she can do, of course, well, if you have an instrument, then you can actually test this directly. And that's what she does. So there is, again, direct evidence, not from our work, but from her work, which suggests that there is, in fact, in India, a link between the marriage market and sex selection. And the last point to make is that in the Bhaskar and Edlund model, the sort of assumption is that basically, parents just have an intrinsic preference for sons over daughters. But there's a slightly more nuanced view of this, which is that, in fact, often the preference is not just for boys over girls, but that parents want to have at least one son. That's how people often describe it. Now, that is a different prediction. Now, what that says is, of course, is that what's going to happen is that as you move up to higher birth orders, you're going to have more and more sex selection, or worse and worse sex ratios. So the simple intuition is, suppose you want to have 5 kids. Then when the first kid is born, imagine there's no ultrasound. The kid is born, and then you can at that point decide what to do with it. So when the first kid is born, the kid is a girl, then you say that's fine. The second kid is a girl, you say that's fine. But then as you start to move closer and closer to number 5, you're going to be more and more likely to do the sex selection. And that's what people have noticed, by the way, in India as well as in China, that as you move up, to higher birth orders, you're going to start to see this kind of thing. Now, we're going to see this in our data as well, by the way. You see precisely this pattern. So as I said, it's not that these other motivations are not present in our data. But the key prediction of our model is that even for the firstborn children, you should be seeing some sex selection. This is not sex selection at birth, but for the firstborn children, you should also be seeing different, some kind of bias in the sex ratios. And this is what you see. This is our data. This is data from the IHDS, and this is data from the DHS. And I just want to be clear here, this is not the sex ratio at birth, which is people often assume that the sex ratio at birth for the firstborn children is unbiased. And that may very well be true. What we're looking at here is firstborn children aged 0 to 6. And what you see for them, both through all of these data sources, is that there is bias if you take 102.5 as the benchmark. Of course, things get worse for higher order children. So if you look at all children, for example, the bias is worse. But notice here that our data and the South Indian average are really very similar. It's about 108 or 109. The first-born children is about 105 or 106. The other thing to take away from this is look at the amount of data that we have. We're going to have 80,000 kids aged 0 to 6. If you look at the kids aged 0 to 6 living in South India from the IHDS or the DHS, it will be somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. Okay? So now, let me very quickly, how much time do I have? Can you just tell me? Oh, plenty. That's plenty. That's plenty. Wonderful. That's totally fine. Okay. So let me now just give you some evidence which lines up with the model. Okay. Just to be clear, there are 3 things that we want to be looking at. One is hypergamy or the matching. What we want to see is that as you move down the wealth distribution, the gap between the boys and the girls keeps widening. The second thing we want to look at is the dowries. You want to see that as you move up the wealth distribution, the dowries are going to be increasing. Now, with the dowries, there's 2 effects here. There is the sort of an absolute wealth effect, and there's a relative wealth effect because of the bequest motive and the price motive. These 2 things are kind of, all totally interlinked. But what we should be seeing, of course, is that wealthier families in general are going to be paying higher dowries. And, of course, in particular, that you actually have positive dowries at every point in the wealth distribution. Okay, that we can show that. And the last thing we're going to do is to look at the sex selection itself. And in that, that's the core of the analysis, and there we'll focus a lot on the causality. Okay? So this is the data on the hypergamy. And let me start off with something very descriptive. So there was one question in the household survey which sort of asked the household head about the wealth of the child's spouse's family. Okay? And the question is very crude. The question just simply said, was the spouse's family of the same wealth, wealthier, or less wealthy? That was it. And so remember here what we have are marriages of the children in the last 5 years. And some of the children are boys and some of the children are girls. So for the boys, the spouse's family is reported to be wealthier 9% of the time and less wealthy 29% of the time. For the girls, the spouse's family is reported to be wealthier 18% of the time and less wealthy 17% of the time. And you can easily reject that these two distributions are the same. Now, of course, this is not quite right because these things are not exactly matching up. But then, of course, these kids are not exactly matching with each other either. But the general sort of pattern here is that the men are marrying down and the girls are marrying up. Okay, so this is, as I said, just some descriptive evidence. What we could do is, of course, what we would really like to do is to look across the wealth distribution. But the big challenge for us empirically is that we don't know the wealth of the spouse's family. It's hard enough to get the wealth of the family itself in rural India. And in fact, what we use, I'll talk about that later on in a moment, but what we use to get the wealth is in fact information that we have on the annual income of these households, which is like a flow measure from the stock of wealth. We don't have direct measure of the wealth in any other way. And for the spouse's family, we know nothing at all about their wealth directly. But the trick that we use over here is to take advantage of the fact that in India, even in South India, a very large fraction of marriages are to people from other villages. And this is something which just happened very coincidentally. I was working on another project in the UK on South Asian immigrants to the UK. And as part of that, I was at one point in the British Library. And I just accidentally stumbled on this data that was collected by the British colonial government in 1871 for this region. It's not for the whole country, but in northern Tamil Nadu, I have information on all the villages at that point in time, 1871, on the amount of revenue that was collected by the colonial government per acre of cultivated land. And the way that they did this was they actually very, very carefully figured out the quality of land, the amount of irrigation, etc. And based on that, they computed what the profit would have been for each plot in these villages. And then based on that, they actually set the tax on these particular farmers, the ryots. So this is only for the villages which had the rayotwari system. So there are some villages in the area which had the jamindari system. So for those, we don't have any information. But for most of the villages, we do know, in fact, what effect we have essentially a measure of the productivity or the income that was being generated at that point in time, 1871. Now, what is remarkable is that this measure that we have is a very strong predictor of income today in our study area. And this is despite the fact that at that point in time, one of the most important determinants of your wealth was the type of irrigation. And if you had access to tank irrigation, then you could grow rice and you would have much higher incomes. And today, of course, this is completely irrelevant. But those initial conditions seem to very strongly determine incomes today. So if you interact the historical revenue per acre of cultivated land with a full set of caste fixed effects, and then you use that to predict income today from our census for the households over the last year, which is just the annual income reported by these households, the F statistic is greater than 20. So it's a very good, very strong predictor. And what's nice about that is that once you've estimated this relationship, you can use it to predict for each caste what the income or the wealth would be in any village in the study area. And that is what we use. So just to be clear, what we have here is a very crude measure of the wealth. And in particular, we don't know what is the per capita wealth, which is really the correct measure to be using. But nevertheless, what you get here is, I think, a very nice, very interesting pattern. By the way, this is very statistically significant. What you have on the y-axis is the rank of the husband in the caste wealth distribution. And on the x-axis, what you have is a rank of the bride's family in the caste wealth distribution. And what the model says is that, remember, that boys should be wealthier than girls, and the gap should be widening as you move down the wealth distribution. So this is exactly what the model would predict. The grooms are wealthier than the brides. But what the model would also predict is that this line should basically converge to the 45-degree line at the top. And it doesn't. It's basically rotated too much. In some sense, the slope is too flat. And why is that the case? I think the reason for that is because you have measurement error in your wealth variable over here. And the reason for that is because you don't have the per capita wealth. In the model, you have just one parent and one child. But in reality, of course, households are of different sizes. And for this part of the analysis, not for the stuff that follows, we don't really know what the size is of the spouse's family. We don't know that. So we can't make this adjustment. And for that reason, this slope is too flat. And that's also why this intercept here is too high. This really should be more like 0.1 or something. So the whole thing should have been flipped over a little bit. But what's important is two things. The first is that, in fact, the boys are wealthier than the girls at the bottom of the wealth distribution, and that there is, in fact, convergence. Okay? Now we can move on to the dowry analysis, which doesn't suffer from these problems, because for the dowry, we actually have the household's own wealth. Now, we have two measures of wealth for the household. We have the income from the survey in the last year, which was done about a couple of years after the census, and then we have the income from the census. And what we're doing here to purge the measurement error is to take the average of the two. Now, of course, we know the family size as well, so we can construct the per capita wealth. And by the way, if you ran this regression, I'm not showing this to you over here, but if you ran the regression with just wealth or with per capita wealth, of course, properly normalized, the coefficient would be much bigger with the per capita wealth, which is consistent with this idea that when you just use the wealth itself without the adjustment for family size, you're naturally going to introduce some amount of measurement error. And then what you get is the pattern here. Notice that you always have dowries across the wealth distribution. And the dowries are increasing very steeply with the household's position in the wealth distribution. Okay, and the last thing I want to do now, and this is basically just showing that for boys and girls, it pretty much tracks together. Okay, so nothing really is different. And the last thing I want to do now is to basically talk about the core sort of empirical result, which has to do with the relationship between the gender of the child and the household's position in its caste wealth distribution. So when it comes to the dowry, of course, there are two things going on. There's an absolute wealth effect and there's a relative wealth effect. And we can't really disentangle those two, because one is the bequest motive, the other is the price motive. And so that doesn't really matter. But here, when it comes to sex selection, there's one thing which is the driving force, which is that as you move down the wealth distribution, because of this accumulation of unmatched boys, girls are going to be better off. And therefore, you should be having less sex selection. So we really want to focus on the relative wealth effect. And that is very useful, because what you can do is essentially control for the household's absolute wealth in the estimation. And this is important because most alternative explanations for sex selection that have been put forward would work through the absolute wealth, not the relative wealth. So a number of different explanations have been put forward for why, for example, sex selection has worsened over time. Okay, and Sonia, again, who's sitting in the room, has contributed quite a bit to these different things. There's stories about how there's been a reduction in fertility coupled with the demand for at least one son. There's stories about improved access to sex selection technology. There's changes in property rights, etc. And the point is that these are all stories about changes over time. Our analysis is in the cross-section, but you could imagine that, again, the same forces could generate variation in the cross-section depending on household characteristics like wealth, etc. But the key to the identification is that in our story, what matters is the household's position in its per capita wealth distribution. And what is per capita wealth? Per capita wealth is constructed as a ratio of the wealth of the household and the size of the family. That's it. There's just two variables. And the basic point is that if you could somehow construct a very flexible control function, which essentially has two arguments, the wealth and the family size, and you could control for that, then you would be done. And the reason why you can do that is because you have data over multiple castes with different wealth distributions. And so what you're doing once you have this very flexible control function is you're looking at two households which have the same wealth and the same family size, but who happen to be at different positions in their caste wealth distribution. And the point is, at the end of the day, the only threat to identification is that one of these two variables, either wealth or family size, either independently or jointly, is going to be correlated with one of these factors which have been put forward that determines sex selection independently. And that's all you need to do. And so what we do here is we essentially include this control function. What we put in is wealth squared, wealth cubed. We put in family size dummies, and then we interact the whole thing. So it's a very flexible sort of function, and then conditional on that, you can look at the gender of the child depending on the household's position in the caste wealth distribution. So the blue line here is the unconditional relationship. This is just saying that, look, as the household gets wealthier, notice here that as the household gets wealthier, this is just in the data, you can see that the probability that the child is a girl keeps going down. When you have the control function, and you're essentially non-parametrically identified, it's actually even better behaved. Now it's basically monotonically decreasing, and if anything, this line is steeper than the blue line. And as I said, this is the key. This is the key to the identification. The advantage that we have here is that we have data on multiple castes. And so you can control very flexibly for the two variables that could potentially generate spurious correlation, the wealth and the family size. And once you have control for that, then you see, if anything, that the result gets even stronger. This is just showing you that the same result is obtained if you looked at different ways of measuring the household's rank in the wealth distribution. You could use all households in the caste, you could use only households with kids aged 0 to 6, and nothing changes. This is now basically a more stringent test where you now look caste by caste. And what you find is, there are 12 castes which account for over 80% of the population in the study area. And what you find is that this pattern continues all the way across except for 3 castes, one over here and these. And I would argue that the reason why it doesn't work is very little data, less than 2,000 observations. If you looked at the 7 to 13-year-old kids, then these 3 castes behave perfectly well. And the largest caste, you always get the same pattern. Now, in terms of the magnitudes, what does it look like? Basically, 70 to 80% of the variation that we can predict in the sex ratios is within caste. So most of it is actually within caste in our study area. And if we look at it in terms of the actual range of sex ratios across the distribution, it ranges from 97, which is a slight surplus of girls, to as much as 117. Remember, this is basically the level of sex selection that you see in states like Delhi, Punjab, and Haryana. So you have as much variation in sex ratios within caste in this one district, where the actual average sex ratio is just 108, than there is across all states in the country. And we have an explanation based on the marriage market for this particular pattern. Now, what we can do is to use our equilibrium model to do, I'm going to take 2 minutes, okay, to do some interesting counterfactual policy experiments. So once we've solved the model numerically, then estimating the structure parameters is not a big deal. All you need to do is to match on different, different points in the wealth distribution. So once you've estimated the structure parameters, you can do different counterfactual policy experiments. And what I want to do now is talk about one of them, which is quite popular, quite common, a conditional cash transfer scheme in which basically parents are given a transfer if they report the birth of a girl and give her the initial immunizations. And then when she completes primary school, they get a second transfer. When she completes secondary school, they get a third transfer. And then there is an insurance cover which matures when she turns 18 or 20, and the money goes into a bank account which is in her name. Now, we're agnostic about whether this money goes to her parents, or to her boy's parents. Okay, we're agnostic about that. But the point is that this is the way that these schemes are organized. And in addition, many of these schemes are restricted to low-income families. And you could see right away that this is the problem, because we've seen that, in fact, the problem here is not about the poor, it's actually about the wealthy. And so the question is, what are the consequences of this particular restriction on the patterns of sex selection? And what we're going to see is, in fact, that a very well-intentioned program could actually have unintended consequences. And this is very similar in some ways to work by Anukriti, for example, where she looks at a similar kind of scheme, but where the other restriction is that you need to also reduce fertility. And what she finds is, in fact, the net effect, in fact, is negative in that case too. And this is what you see over here, but for a different reason. So the blue line is basically our predicted sex ratio. And there are, in the simulated model, there are 8 wealth classes. And so now we've flipped over to the usual thing here. So the range is from about 105 to about 113 in our data, okay, in our model. And so the first thing we're going to do is to have a policy where we're going to basically give a transfer to parents in the bottom 2 wealth classes if they have a girl. And of course, this is a good thing. The direct effect is positive. You can see that the sex ratios get better for the first and the second wealth class. They're below the blue line. But notice what happens to the higher wealth classes. The sex ratios are actually worse than the benchmark. And why is that the case? And this is the key feature of our model, which you would not get, for example, with Bhaskar or Edlund's model, where you don't have this linkage within the marriage market. And the reason why this is happening is because when you have this when you have an addition, you have more girls at the bottom, they're going to put pressure on the dowry. And the dowries are going to increase not only at the bottom, but across the full wealth distribution. And the consequence of this is that, in fact, wealthier parents, of course, this depends on how the dowry function looks, but at least in our model, the way it's estimated, what ends up happening is, in fact, that the wealthier parents then end up having less girls because of the pressure from the dowry. And the overall effect of this is to actually make things worse, just like Anukriti finds, but of course for a different reason. And I think the point of this is to emphasize that when you think about different policies, you really want to think about the fundamentals. You want to think about the underlying economics and get that right when you think about making policy prescriptions. Because here's an example of a very well-intentioned program which ended up, which would, at least if the model was right, have had unintended negative consequences. Now what you could have done instead, and that's the most effective policy, would have been to give a transfer directly to the girl when she was married. And now her altruistic parents would internalize this, and they would take this into account, and they would therefore end up having more girls, dowries would go down, and in fact the effect would be very positive. And the reason for that, of course, is because you're avoiding all the seepage that works through the marriage market. Okay? And the last point I want to make is, is that this is one sort of way of dealing with the problem, taking as given the marriage market imperfections that are in place. But what could we do to actually get at the root cause of the problem, which is in fact this norm that all girls must marry, as well as the way that this marriage market is structured? One thing you could do is to try to increase female labor force participation. This is outside of the scope of our model. I want to conjecture here because I think this is super important. Female labor force participation in India is very low, and it's been low for a very long time, and it's not getting any better. This, of course, has consequences for growth. But what we're seeing here is it also might have consequences for other social problems. Because if women were working, then the social norm that all girls must marry would perhaps start to break down. Because now, even if they didn't marry, they could live independently outside of their natal homes. If they did marry, then their bargaining power in their marital homes would go up. What this means in the context of the model is that alpha parameter would actually go down. They would have they would get a larger share of the transfer from the boy's parent. And for both of these reasons, sex selection would go down as well. So let me stop over here. May I just quickly respond to Debraj's question, because I kind of didn't, Debraj, may I? So yes, there are these two effects, and I think the point that you're talking about, this, the fact that girls on the short side, does that really play a role at all in our model? It does actually, because what it does is it forces the boys, the last boys to marry, they are forced down to their outside option, and that is where it is coming from. And the reason is because there is a shortage of girls, so the last girl to marry will basically push that guy down to where he's indifferent between being married and not being married. And that essentially pins down, even in our model, the level of the dowry, that last point. Okay? Yeah.
I was just wondering that if you introduce credit market in the dowry, for dowry, will anything change in the model? So if parents can take loan and pay dowry?
But actually, interestingly, in this model, it's not been driven by a credit market imperfection, because here we never put any restriction on how much they can give. We never say that, oh, the reason why you have the imperfection is because the parents would like to give more, but there's a credit market imperfection which prevents them from doing that. There's no restriction here. They have a total amount of wealth, and they can distribute that wealth in any way they want, at any time they want. So what's interesting here is that, in fact, it's not been driven at all by a credit market imperfection in that sense. It's being driven by these particular features of the marriage institution. So that would create, a whole other set of issues which I haven't really thought through at all. We haven't really thought through.
I was thinking of that if the low-wealth parents can take loan from the market and pay the dowry.
No, but there's no question of a loan. The issue here.
No, I mean, I was wondering that if you introduce that, will something change in the model?
Oh, I'm sure it would change, because then the amount of the dowry would change as well. But in a way that I can't, as I said, I can't really think through. It's something which this is already complicated enough. The moment you try to tell me what would happen if you change something, I really would not be able to tell you what would be the effect on the equilibrium, etc. Right? But in this model, as I said, there is no imperfection. You obviously can never borrow more than your wealth, obviously, right? So you have a fixed amount of wealth, and what we show in the model, what we assume in the model, is that you can, when the time comes at marriage, the girl's parent can basically give any amount that he wants to the girl in the dowry. There's no restriction on that. He could give, all his wealth if he wanted to. Yeah.
Thanks so much. A couple quick questions. One, I just wanted to ask about the cohort effect, because if, for example, right now we're assuming that boys and girls are coming from the same cohort, and if the outside is the way that you would think about the outside option for boys would be like if they can't get matched to the girls in their cohort, they start going down, like the next cohort, the next younger cohort. And the second thing that I had a question about was that graph where you were showing there would have been that convergence on that 45-degree line, but you don't see that towards the higher, like there was some sort of like tail towards the higher income girls, so it's the higher wealth girls. Is that because the marriage constraint is now becoming more binding, where, for example, girls who are that wealthy now are like they're more forced to get married, in the sense that the pressure to get married is higher, so that's why it doesn't matter anymore if they're getting matched to boys who are wealthier than they are, because they're already at the end of the wealth distribution?
No, actually, let me answer your questions in reverse order.
Sure.
So the second point that you made, I think it's just our limitation.
Okay.
The reason why you don't get the convergence is because we don't have the right measure of the wealth. The problem is that for that particular part of the analysis, we cannot really adjust for the size of the family. And what that does is, and what we're doing is here that we are predicting based on that particular measure of ours, every household from a given caste in a given village is assigned the same wealth in that particular measure. And that naturally is going to generate this measurement error, which is going to bias the coefficient towards 0.
Yeah.
And that's why that whole line is basically pivoted that way, and that's why. So I wish I could tell you that there was a real story for it, but I think this is just that we just don't have the right way of doing it.
Issue.
And if you looked at the dowry stuff, I didn't show this to you, but if you actually ran the dowry regressions with just the wealth versus the per capita wealth, taking the z-score, okay, so you're adjusting for the size, you will see the coefficient with the per capita wealth is much, much larger than with the overall wealth, which sort of suggests that this is probably the reason why we're getting that tilting. Now, the question about the cohorts is a very good one. The natural thought would be, well, why don't they just marry into the next cohort and then carry on, and then the age gaps would just start to widen over time, right? So there's 2 points here which I think are worth noting. The first is, and I think Bhaskar talks about this in his paper, this can't go on forever. Because if you start to marry down, the age gap will keep increasing over time, and at some point the girls would be 10 years old or something, and you could not keep doing this permanently. But the second point, I think, which is more important, is that in this particular context, you have dowries. Most stories of this kind of thing where you match with younger women are in environments where you have bride wealth. So, for example, when you have polygyny, and Michel Tertelt has some work on this, and Bhaskar is talking about it in the context of his model, where you also have bride wealth, then essentially men are buying women. And so when you don't have enough women available, you go down and buy younger women. Now, in our model, and this gets back to what Debat was also asking me, it's actually reversed. The last guy who's to become single, or the first guy to become single, that guy, it's a choice. He has his outside options. He would rather be single than be married to the least wealthy girl. So he's not willing to pay the dowry that she would be willing to accept. So he's not willing to accept the dowry that she'd be willing to pay to marry with him. And so she ends up marrying with the guy just above him. And of course, that's because the dowry is increasing in a certain particular fashion. Now, by the same argument, that guy who stays single in that first cohort, he's not going to want to marry the least wealthy girl in the next cohort. For the exact same reason, he's not going to want to do that either. So in our model, in fact, you would not even see this kind of matching, where you would go to the next generation, to the next cohort, or the cohort after that to pick up younger girls. And my sense from India is that you don't really see this kind of pattern. You don't see, in fact, that over time, with sex selection in North India, that there's been this huge sort of, increase in the age gap, I believe, and someone might correct me on that. But this is something which people in Africa will talk about all the time. That you have these younger women marrying with older and older men, especially when there's polygyny. You don't see that over here, and I suspect it's for this reason. And again, it comes out very nicely from our model. So this is not, in fact, a mechanism. Now, of course, what that means is that there is going to be now a surplus of men. And we hear stories about this in North India. It's too early in South India yet, I think. But in North India, surely we hear stories about this, where in fact they're importing women and pretending that they're from the same caste. And then there are also even more sensational stories where you have this kind of Pandava kind of thing, right? Where they're like, brothers are all, with one, whatever.
Okay, we can have 2 more questions. Okay. I had a question about cohorts, which is similar. I might follow up later. I have another really simple question, which I've looked for in data, and I think your data could answer. Just you've emphasized that dowries are increasing in wealth in absolute terms, but what about in relative terms? Do wealthy parents pay a higher fraction? A higher fraction
you mean
of
in
their
terms
wealth
of
in
the
dowry?
wealth?
Yeah.
So you know what? Off the top of my head, as I see it from, because I showed the absolute, right? So because it was flat initially, it must be decreasing to begin with. So I'm just looking at, just eyeballing what you. I can answer you sort of. So for sure, it's going to be decreasing because if you remember, it was kind of flat and then it was increasing, right? And in that later part, I can't really tell. It may be increasing steeply enough at the end. I'm guessing it's probably increasing steeply enough at the end that it will start to turn up. But it's going to be sort of essentially decreasing initially and then increasing as you go up.
But it's also flat because of pooling, equilibrium, and reporting, right? You don't want to report too little dowry.
So it could be. No, absolutely. So the thing with the dowry is it's very hard. I mean, if you look at the difference between the men and the women, my guess, is that it's probably there's got to be some reporting stuff going on here, right?
Yeah, especially near the lower end.
It could be. So that's why I said I don't want to. So that's the problem with the dowry is that it's hard to tell whether this is just reporting error or some kind of But based on the data that we have, I would say that it's initially decreasing in the relative sense that you're talking about, and then it probably is starting to increase at the end.
But in your model, would it matter if you modeled the
No, it doesn't
fraction
matter
of
because we
wealth?
don't. No, in fact, what I showed you earlier was as a fraction of the wealth in the simulations.
'Cause
in the
it's
model.
related to whose
Yeah.
wealth, which I think Debraj asked whether you're looking at the wealth of the boy's family or the girl's family, and you said the boy's family. But if it were the wealth of the girl's family that's in some manner imposed a constraint, then the fraction of their wealth that was paid in dowry would matter.
It would, but I don't think, as I said, I don't think the model has any, we don't have any clear prediction. I mean, the numerical simulation would suggest that in fact the relative wealth should be, it should be increasing. The relative dowry should be increasing as you move up the wealth distribution. But in terms of the analytical results, all that we have analytically is that there should be positive dowries. And that we certainly see. But in terms of how it varies across the distribution, I don't think we have a very clear prediction of how it should be looking.
Okay, that one last
Yeah. Hi. So I wanted to ask you a question about specifically, as you mentioned in the former half, that regardless of marriage payments, don't you think sex selection is affected by parents viewing the son as a old age payment, perhaps, and also the fact that your study is in South India, so the male and female wages are closer in the ratio than the rest of the regional analysis that would happen, which would affect the sex selection and perhaps the household selection of the opportunity cost of a woman having a child also would be different for South India.
So what was the first question again? Sorry, that was...
The marriage payments, how household views a son as
Yeah, so
sole
that's,
executor.
okay, yeah. So as I said, I mean, we're not trying at all to claim that these other stories that have been put forward are not relevant. Even in our data, the firstborn, the sex ratio for the firstborn children, so I didn't show this to you, I just showed you for the firstborn and overall. The firstborn children have the most, have the least biased sex ratios. It's about 105. And it turns out the second-born children it's roughly the same. It's for the third-born and above that you see a big sort of, worsening. So that pattern that you see is very much in line with the alternative story that parents want to have at least one son. In South India, basically now at this point, you have close to replacement fertility. So you can see that very quickly you're going to start to see this thing jumping up. And you see it by the third kid, you start to see this thing coming up. So as I said, we have no issue here with alternative explanations. All that I would like to claim is that there is this other explanation, and I think Sonia's work kind of gets directly at that. I mean, we can sort of make a sort of, general sort of story about how these two things are linked in terms of the patterns that we see. Hers directly links the dowries to the sex selection. So we know that this is out there in the data. The second point about these other things like, the returns to boys versus girls, differences in fertility in South India, it's true that those things are different. But as I told you in terms of the identification, we can control for that in a very nice way because ultimately the only threat to identification is that there's either the wealth or the family size that are going to be either independently or jointly correlated with all these other determinants of sex selection, which work through the absolute wealth or which work through the size of the family. So once you've controlled with this very flexible control function, then we're basically picking up the relative effect, which is what is the story behind our thing. And I would argue that that thing is going to be the same in all castes, because all castes are organized the same, they all have these patterns of marriage, and so there's no reason why you would not expect to see this in other parts of the country. That is the point that I'm making. I'm not saying that the overall sex ratios will be the same everywhere. Of course, it's going to be much worse in North India than it is in South India. But there are many other factors out there. But the factor that we are picking up, I think, is really common to the whole country because it has to do with the marriage market. And I would claim that no one has ever shown you this kind of data Just because of the data. It's nothing else. It's not because we're smarter than anyone else. It's because we have the data to actually show this.